Let me begin with some general comments about chapter 10 in Matthew. The whole of Matthew 10, 1 to 42, has been characterized as the mission sermon of Jesus. He addresses it not to the crowds, but to 12 disciples with names, those we commonly refer to as the 12 apostles. After delivering the sermon, Jesus himself goes to other towns to minister and preach as opposition slowly builds against him. Matthew 10, 1 to 15 opens with a promise that the missionary disciples will have, like Jesus himself, authority and power over unclean spirits. The geographical boundaries of the mission are limited to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. At this stage, there is no mission to pagans and Greeks. Jesus instructs the missionaries to announce that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They are told to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, and drive out demons. Extraordinary as these powers are, the missionaries themselves are to travel with no provisions. Lodging will be provided by those who welcome the missionaries. Jesus says, quote, "Look for a worthy person in town and stay there. Say peace on the house you enter as a guest." If the missioners meet hidden hospitality, they are told to kick the dust of the town off their feet. No time to waste pleading the message. These first 15 verses of detailed instruction open the mission sermon. The 9 following verses, chapter 10, 16 to 25, serve as a warning. They will face not just inhospitality, but outright persecution. Jesus tells them that he will be the reason for missioners facing opposition at home, a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. This domestic strife reappears in the first verses of our Lectio text. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The next 6 verses, chapter 10, 26 to 32, counsel the missioners against fear. The Father's protection will not be lacking. The very hairs of their head are numbered. Their witness to Jesus will be their salvation, but if they are ashamed of him, Jesus will be ashamed of them before his Father. There's not a word in the whole sermon predicting the success of the mission. Just the opposite. Quote, "I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves," Jesus says. Not a reassuring image. Sheep inclined to run away or huddle in fear when confronted with danger, not a good omen. So we are given a mixed metaphor for mission. The missioners are told to be shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves. This has become a cliche. What does the strange mixture of the snake and the dove say about mission? One way to read it is that the disciples are to strike a balance between cleverness and simplicity, a naive form of cunning, if you will. Are these disciples asked to be like monks in the Department of State, like nuns at the stock exchange? The wisdom tradition in Jesus is intruding here. The candor about conflict which Jesus dispenses in the mission sermon is bracing. Recall the words of Winston Churchill to the House of Commons. "All I have to offer you are blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The summons to extraordinary courage and suffering is in direct proportion to the urgency involved. Great leaders do not downplay the price to be paid to secure freedom and hope. In Jesus' case, the imminent inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven is that urgency which must be announced without delay. For him as well, the risk in doing so is to incite opposition, rejection, persecution. These are words meant for people ready to lose their lives in a cause, for martyrs. This is a sermon tailored to the circumstances of our current national urgency of confronting racism. In this sermon, The dark shadow of Jesus' own destiny is cast backwards across the ministry. Delivered to the disciples, it is cast forward across their mission. Indeed, it covers the entire history of the church. We followers of a crucified Messiah. With this as the overall context needed to explain the 6 verses of our Lectio, let's turn to Matthew 10:37 to 42. They finish off the mission sermon by putting a simple top coat of dramatic summaries on it. Note the rhetoric. The relative pronoun whoever gets repeated 9 consecutive times in these verses, which Matthew has assembled as the sermon's peroration. The entire missionary sermon, of course, is surely the work of the evangelist, taking isolated sayings of Jesus from oral tradition and other sources to compose his charge to the disciples being sent. No longer merely students sitting at the feet of the teacher, the disciples now are becoming ambassadors who are spiritually and psychologically outfitted for the mission. More than ambassadors, the disciples are Jesus' own representatives. They are to speak and act exactly like him, say what he says, do what he does. In Matthew 10, the mission of Jesus is in the process of becoming the mission of his community, meant to carry on his work. In Matthew 16, Jesus appoints Simon as Peter, the disciple who has just confessed by a miracle of recognition that Jesus is the Christ, and who has simultaneously refused to accept any suffering involved. In Matthew 16, the sayings in our Lectio about the cross and losing one's life to gain it appear as well. Matthew will not let us forget how confession, which seems orthodox, can miss the whole point. At last, then, we arrive at the Lectio verses for today. Traditionally, as I said, they're called the conditions of discipleship. More specifically, I would say they are the conditions of missionary discipleship, the expression used by Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis to capture the crucial difference between the new evangelization and an earlier version of evangelization simply satisfied with spreading the faith by cultural osmosis, domestic absorption, formal catechesis. The missionary disciple spreads the faith differently in secular and religiously pluralistic America. If we contemporary missionary disciples were able to raise dead people and cure the insane and heal the sick, as the mission charge given in Matthew 10 by Jesus for these first missionaries does, we'd be putting hospitals and funeral parlors out of business. Clearly, we need to be in search of cultural analogs that resemble such extraordinary miracles of faith for our secular age. Last often quoted in the Conditions of Discipleship section of our Lectio is the section that follows it, subtitled Rewards. The lead rhetorical pronoun whoever is constantly repeated here as well. But the focus changes to any person receiving a disciple, or receiving a prophet, or receiving a righteous person. The very act of receiving or welcoming the missionary disciple is equivalent to receiving and welcoming Jesus and his Father. In the last verse, receiving changes to giving a cup of cold water to little ones. The expression little ones is a synonym for missionary disciples themselves, not for a group of thirsty kids. The cup of cold water is to slake the thirst of the itinerant missionary walking without money or resources from town to town in Galilee, proclaiming the kingdom and working miracles. A second rhetorical marker to note, in addition to the pronoun whoever, is the phrase not worthy of me. Used about filial or parental love, the contrast could not be more radical, especially for a Jew, where family and offspring count for almost everything. To say love Christ more than your own child or your parents is a Semitic hyperbole, and more, It shocks, and it is meant to shock, of course. But these verses explain the earlier verses about Jesus bringing divisions within the families of his disciples. Honoring father and mother is in the Decalogue, after all. The obvious implication and Christological question would be, who does Jesus of Nazareth think he is? Whoever loves father or mother, son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever, of course, is every man and every woman, each of us. Anyone who can do these things or thinks about them as something possible and worth doing, or who attempts to interpret and apply them in their individual circumstances as we are wanting to do in a Lectio. The mission sermon is delivered to 12 disciples, who are immediately called apostles and who are known in tradition simply as the 12, with Peter as first among them. As scholars have remarked, only the Petrine office itself survived the apostolic period from the period of the original 12 apostles, which was never institutionalized as such by name after the deaths of the individuals themselves. The Mormons are an exception to that. The verses we have about missionary disciples and apostles, however, are directed to anyone, to whoever who wishes to be a disciple. For the rest of this Lectio, let me focus on what I consider its two most important sayings. Whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The first saying, in effect, summarizes the mission sermon in a nutshell. Following Christ means following him to the end. It means following not just a dogma, but a way of life implied in the dogma. The cross is clearly a symbol. Jesus' final days in his passion, death, and resurrection are familiar to us from the many details we have in the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John passion narratives. The scattered passion predictions given by Jesus in the Gospels give his disciples unwelcome advance notice of a future fate. Historians use a Latin expression for a prediction of a future event with a suspect specificity about it. They call it a vaticinium ex eventu. It means a prophecy of an event which is composed after the event has taken place and which is placed before it. Its history thrown backwards in the disguise of a prediction. In the passage we're discussing, whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me, clearly sounds like a condition of discipleship wrapped inside a very specific allusion to Jesus' later passion and death. Why a cross? We know, but how can the disciples know? No one imagines Jesus as saying in the future, I want you all to line up behind me on a Via Crucis with a wooden cross on your back. We immediately reinterpret the cross image. The noblest reinterpretation of the cross is suffering, which befalls us by virtue of our acting like Christ in some way, by testifying to him by word or action, and receiving suffering or death as a consequence. The martyr is the preeminent follower in this respect. These were the first saints honored by the church. The philosopher Kierkegaard once wrote, the first rulers of the world were the tyrants. The last rulers will be the martyrs. Nonviolent witness and testimony to the truth and to the good in the end prevails. Jesus, Bonhoeffer, Gandhi, King, and Oscar Romero are the exemplars of it. The second way we interpret the cross is any form of suffering whatsoever, a sickness, a difficult relationship, a test which tests us beyond our strength, which does not make us lose our faith or turn hostile. It is the cross of revolutionary patience. It is the aspect of the cross where Jesus refuses to attack his executioners. In her book, Suffering, the theologian Dorothy Zola observed that the most important distinction we need to make about suffering is the distinction between avoidable and unavoidable suffering. She makes the crucial and common sense observation in it that avoidable suffering is to be avoided. Is a bad marriage avoidable or unavoidable suffering? That depends. Unavoidable suffering is not just accidents, but suffering which is accepted for a higher principle and value and promise one wants to keep. Suffering one could avoid, but chooses not to. The next statement that I want to focus on toward the end of the Lectio is this: whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Other synoptic variants of this paradoxical formula are found in Luke 17. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses it will save it. In Mark 8, for whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. Other parallels are found in Matthew 10, Luke 9. In John 12, the maxim, lose life to gain life, is interpreted through the image of the grain, which dies and produces much fruit as a consequence. The text is used in one of the gospel lectionary choices for funeral liturgies. Just a grain of wheat, if it doesn't die, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. Of course, grains of wheat don't actually die, as the human body does. Bodies corrupt and disintegrate into ashes. We can't plant them. Seeds are transformed by soil, sun, and water into what has always lain dormant in the biological potency of the germ. Death in that case means transformation. It is a metamorphosis, a new shape. I interpret this as an evangelical proverb, lose your life to find your life, meant to distill into one maxim the narrative of the cross and resurrection. As a proverb, it is something of a paradox or even an enigma, exactly the way death and resurrection are enigmatic. We find the saying in the context of Peter's Christological confession I mentioned earlier, in which the passion and death image is unavoidable as the interpretation of the Christ in the disciples losing one's life. In Matthew 16, this saying follows Peter's famous confession of Jesus as the Messiah and his denial that suffering is involved. Get behind me, Satan, Jesus says. At this point, we have Jesus saying, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. A little personal reflection. On November 25th, 1984, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who was teaching in the John Newveen Chair at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, delivered a sermon in the university chapel. The text he preached on that day was our text, was a Matthean variant on Matthew 10, Matthew 16:25, losing one's life to find one's life. Given the choice in a university sermon addressed to believers and non-believers, Ricoeur chose to pass over the Christological context of Matthew 16 to explore the maxim as a general piece of human wisdom. He paused to say how so much Christian evangelization today could be characterized as little more than commercialized religious advertising, indiscreet and arrogant. Taking his cue from the phrase to gain the world or to gain one's life, the philosopher noted how Christians so easily point their fingers at the economic and political spheres where money and power are the way to gain life. They are, but not only those. So he gently pulled a rug out from under the feet of the academics in the pews, all too willing to point fingers at the materialism in society by telling them how they try to gain the world by scholarship and scientific proof. He is not promoting fideism or obscurantism, but intellectual humility. Losing one's life means in part abandoning the self-sufficiency of knowledge and the arrogance of faith. St. Paul, as we know, offers virtually nothing about the historical Jesus in his letters. He does not give a single parable or saying of Jesus. That in itself is remarkable. What he did do was to transform and translate a gospel narrative about Jesus of Nazareth into a gospel kerygma of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. St. Paul created a shorthand formula into which the whole story of Jesus could be distilled and compacted. He is not the only New Testament author to do that. The author of the second letter of St. John did something similar when he compacted the revelation of the God of Israel and Jesus into the single term, love. God is love. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. This maxim, I would say, also serves as a proverbial summary of the gospel. Jesus lost his life for the Father's sake. Now he transfers that mission to his disciples. They are to lose their lives for his sake. But in what does this losing mean? What does it involve? Physical life, social life, a way of life, a lifestyle, something else? Those who have read The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or Simone Weil's Waiting for God, or Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness, understand these verses as the challenge they are intended to be. The challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is to put mission in the starkest terms, only to make courage and hope rise to the occasion. This sermon fulfills the reality principle of Sigmund Freud in evangelical form. Christian discipleship seeks to live in the truth that makes us free, not to live the illusion which makes us comfortable.